In our previous lesson, we introduced 4 rules for building truth trees in predicate logic, and we deployed them for the purpose of determining whether sets of sentences were consistent or inconsistent. And in the cases in which they were consistent, we used them to come up with interpretations in which all the sentences in the set are true, that is, with models for the initial set of sentences. Now, if you remember, we used truth trees in sentential logic not only for testing consistency, but also for testing for validity, logical truth, and equivalence. In this video, we'll focus on validity. The way in which we use truth trees to test for validity in predicate logic is exactly the same as in sentential logic. Recall that a valid argument has no counterexamples. So basically, we're testing the validity of an argument by asking whether it has counterexamples. Moreover, the question of whether an argument has counterexamples is answered by finding out whether it is possible for all of the argument's premises to be true while the conclusion is false. But for truth trees to be useful, we must formulate our question in terms of consistency. So the question becomes whether the set formed by the argument's premises and the negation of its conclusion is consistent. And in terms of trees, this means asking whether we end up with an open or a closed tree. Finally, if there is an open path, then the set is consistent, and so the argument has a counterexample, which makes it invalid. Otherwise, it is valid. So, and again, I'm refreshing your memory, the procedure for testing validity for an argument A is the following. First, form a set comprised by A's premises and the negation of A's conclusion. Then do the truth tree for S. And then, if the finished truth tree for S is closed, then A is valid. Otherwise, it is invalid. So let's go to the blackboard to do an example. Okay, we have an argument here that has 2 premises. The first premise is every P is Q. The second one is there is an X that is P. And the conclusion is that not for every X, not QX. So the question is this argument valid? Well, let's see. So the first step is to put it in the form of an argument to be tested by forms of trees. So we already have the first 2 premises here listed, and then the third element is going to be the negation of the conclusion. And so remember that the conclusion is for every X, not QX, and then we add the negation at the front. This is the negation of the conclusion, say. Okay, now, but if you remember, we have a universal, we have an existential, and then this sentence that is basically a negation, right? Which we can't exploit as it is. So, and again, if you remember, we had a rule when we were doing truth trees for sentential logic that allows us to eliminate double negations. And so we're going to use that rule. So on line 4, we're going to write every X, not QX, and that is by the negation rule. And the sentence we got it from is going to be checked, so we no longer need it. It's closed. Okay, now we have a universal and an existential. And remember that we have a rule of thumb that says that whenever you have universals and existentials, well, you use existentials first. Okay, now we're going to use the existential in 2. There are no names in use, so I can use the first name that comes to mind. Let's say A. So PA, and I got that from the existential that is in 2. And so I'm going to check it. And then I'm left with 2 universals, a universal in 1 and a universal in 4. I can do either of those. I'm going to use the one in 4 because it's shorter, so there's no rule here. So I'm going to say not QA, and that is by the universal in 4. I'm not going to check this universal, but I'm going to write the letter that I used to instantiate here. And so now I can instantiate the other universal, again with the same letter, and again PA, then QA, and that is by the universal in 1, and I write the sentence, the letter that I used to instantiate it. The only thing I have left to do is to break up this conditional. And so I branch it into not PA and QA. And I check this, and this is by the horseshoe rule. Okay, it looks like I'm done with this tree. I can't develop it any further. And so what I have to do is to check whether there is an open branch. Is there an open branch here? Well, notice that in the first branch from left to right, I have PA and I have not PA. So this branch is closed. And in the other branch, I have not QA and I have QA. So this branch contains a contradiction too, and so it closes. And so this whole tree closes. This means that we weren't able to come up with a counterexample, and the argument is valid. Okay, now we have this other argument, and the premise again is every P is Q, and the second premise is there is a Q, and then the conclusion is there is at least something that is P. And I ask you, well, is this argument valid? Well, we're going to think about it. Okay, so let's do the tree. So here, to put it in argument form, we just have to enumerate the lines. And notice that I already added the negation of the conclusion. So I just have to develop this tree. So the first step is to get rid of this negation in front of the existential. So I do the same. I do, there is an X, Nox PX, and that is by the negation of the existential rule, if you remember, right, on line 3. And then I'm going to check this because I won't be needing this sentence anymore. Okay, on line 5, I have 3 quantifiers that I can instantiate. I have the one in 1 we have a universal, and in 4 we have a universal too, and in 2 we have an existential. Again, I'm gonna instantiate or exploit the existential first. There are no names, so I'm gonna use the first name that comes to mind, QA, and that is by existential in 2, and I'm gonna check it because we check existentials. Okay, now we have the 2 universals. And what are we going to do? Well, I'm just going to check the shortest universal first. There's no rule about it. That's just what I'm going to do. So I write the substitution instance for 4. And I'm going to write the name that I just used. Okay. And now on 7, the only quantified sentence that I have left to instantiate is the one on line 1. So I'm going to write this institution instance with the only name that we have so far, which is if PA, then QA. And this is by the universal in 1. And so on line 8, well, I'm going to break up this, this conditional. And I'm going to write not PA, QA. And this is by the conditional, and I'm gonna again check this. Okay, it looks like I'm done with my tree. So is there any branch that is left open? Well, notice that already in the left branch I have in the leftmost branch I have QA, but I don't have not QA, and I have not PA, but I don't have PA. I mean, PA occurs as the antecedent of the conditional in 7, but it doesn't occur on its own. So it looks like here we have a sentence that we have a branch that remains open. So that means that the argument is invalid. And in fact, this branch will give us a counterexample. And so we can recover a counterexample from this branch. And this counterexample is going to have a domain with the only name that we have, which is A. And there are 2 predicates, which are Q and P. So we have PA, and then we have QA. Okay, now QA appears at the beginning on its own, so it's true. And we have not PA, which means that PA is false. Okay, so let's check whether this indeed makes a counterexample for the initial argument. Well, there is an x, so the second premise says there is an x such that qx, and that is made true but qa, so this is true. The first premise said for every x, if px, then qx. Now, what is the only substitution instance that it has in this domain? It is this, PA, then QA. Now, we know that PA is false, and we know that QA is true. Therefore, the whole conditional is true. That means that the only substitution instance, and therefore all the substitution instances of this universal sentence here at the top, come out true. So both premises are true. And what about the conclusion? The conclusion says that there is at least one individual that is P. And that turns out to be false because the only individual that there is, which is A, is not P. So it is false. So that is indeed a counterexample. Okay, we have yet another example. And here we're giving the argument in English. He says, everybody loves everybody, therefore Beth loves Al. Okay, so let's put it in predicate logic and in the form of a tree. So we can do it like this. So on first, for every x, supposing that we're talking just about people, and for every y, LXY. So everybody loves everybody. Now the conclusion is Beth loves Al. So we're going to negate it. So it's not the case that Beth loves Al. So we're going to exploit the universal there by getting its substitution instance. So we get in 3. So notice that we have two names in use, and we have to instantiate the universal with all the names that are so far in the domain. So let's begin just with A, because that's the alphabetical order. There's no reason for me to do it that way. So how are we going to get the substitution instance for this universal sentence? Well, remember that first we'll remove the quantifier to the left, and then wherever there was an X, we're going to write an A. So we end up with Y, L-A-Y. Just going to make it smaller here. And this is from the universal in 1. And we're going to write the letter that we used. Now, we still have another letter, which is B, and we follow the same procedure. And then we get every Y, LBY. This is from the universal in 1, so we do B. Okay, now we are left with two universals, and we need to instantiate it, we need to exploit them, and what we're going to do is simply that we're going to write a substitution instance for each of the letters that we have in our domain, each of the names. So let's begin with the one in 3. And so the first substitution instance is LAA, and this is from the universal in 3, and we write the letter that we have here. And then in the next step, we have LAB. And so we have B here. Okay, we are done so far with the universal in 3, and we proceed with the one in 4. So in line 7, we write LBA, and this is by the universal in 4. So we write LBB. This is by the universal in 4. And so again, we have A and B. And so I'm done with the breaking up of sentences in this tree. And what happens? Do I have an open branch? Well, notice that we have not LBA and then have LBA. And so that means that the branch closes, and that means that the argument is valid, fortunately for Al. And indeed, I could have done things quicker if I just had started by knowing that I have not LBA, I could have started with the universal in 4 and just get the substitution instance for A, and then I would have ended up at line 5. But remember that we're trying to follow all the steps in order to avoid errors. So we finish the tree and we say that this is a valid argument. So we have another example here in English, another argument. It says, some students love at least one dog. Fido is a dog and Beth is a student. Therefore, Beth loves Fido. So let's put it in predicate logic notation and then let's make the tree for it. So there is at least an X that is a student, and there is a Y, there is a dog, and L, XY. Right? Fido is a dog, and Beth is a student. And then the third sentence, the conclusion is Beth loves Fido, but in order to build the counterexample, we had to deny that. So here we already have names in use. We have B and we have F. So we're going to have to choose another name, and I'm going to choose C. So I'm going to write SC, and there is a Y, DY, and LCY. So this would mean something like Claire is a student and Claire loves at least one dog. All right, so this is another conjunction. So we're gonna break it up. Sorry, so we made this and we obtained this by the existential in 1. So this is another conjunction in 6 and we're gonna break it up by the existential and dy and lcy. And these both are by the conjunction in 6. In 8, I'm also left with an existential sentence. So I'm also going to get a substitution instance. And as always, I'm going to remove the quantifier to the left, and I'm going to get, and wherever I see the letter Y, I'm going to replace it with a name. And, well, we have to use a new name. We're going to use the name D. So D, and L, C, D, the existential, and 8, and we check it. And so I'm going to say that, say, Donnie is a dog, and Claire loves Donnie. And last, I break up this conjunction. Okay, and I'm done with the tree. So the tree, I can't develop it any further. And well, are there any contradictions? We see that there are no contradictions, right? So this actually here, a counterexample here. So this argument is invalid, right? So some students, you see that it makes sense that it's invalid. Some students love at least one dog. Fido is a dog and Beth is a student, therefore Beth loves Fido. So it might be that somebody else is, even though Fido is a dog and even though Beth is a student, well, it is another student that loves the dog. Maybe Fido, maybe it's somebody else. And so we can recover a counterexample from this. So here to the right, I summarized the argument, so the tree that I just did, and here we have the argument. And so the domain must have all the letters that we introduced, and we have B, we have C, we have D, and we have F. Okay, and so DD comes out true if you look here at the only branch. DF also comes out true. Fido is a dog. Beth is a student also comes out true. Claire is a student is also true. Beth loves Fido, if you look at line 3, is false. And Claire loves Donnie is also true. Okay, So let's see if this is indeed a counterexample. Well, we know that, let's begin with premise 2. So DF is true and SB is true, so this comes out true. LBF is false. We are directly told that this is false. So is the first premise true? Well, we can see that the fact that Donnie is a dog and that Claire loves Donnie, it makes it true. There's a making true relationship that there is a dog that is loved by Claire. And so we have this substitution instance of this sentence make this existential true. And since we know that SC is true, this whole conjunction is true. And this whole conjunction that is true is a substitution instance of this sentence here, which is itself the first premise. So there is an X that is a student, and we know that that is Claire, and there is a dog that is loved by that student, right? And that is Donnie. Right? That is made true by this. So we can recover a counterexample then for this argument. Okay, let's finish with this example, which has some curious properties. So it says everyone is a parent, therefore Al is his own parent. So this argument is clearly invalid. So we should end up with a finished tree with at least one open branch, right? Well, let's see what happens. So let's put it in predicate logic notation and let's do the tree. So everyone is a parent. This actually has a logical form that says that for every x, there is a y such that x is the parent of y. Okay, that's the premise. And then the conclusion is that Al is its own parent. And so in order to test it, we're going to negate it. Okay, so let's begin by instantiating first universal. And so we have the letter A. And so that's the letter that we're going to use to write the substitution instance. There is a y, PAY. So basically that Al is someone's parent. And so it's by the universal in 1, and we write A, which is the letter that we just used. Okay, now we have an existential, and we have to write a substitution instance for it, but we already have a name in use, so we can't use A. So let's use another name, PAB, and that is going to be by E on 3, and we're going to check it, right? Which is Al's child, let's call it Beth. But notice that we have another letter here in our domain, so we have to reuse the universal. So we're going to write the sentence here, and wherever x occurs, we're going to write P. We're going to write B, sorry. So we're going to write there is a y, P, B, y. And this is by the universal in 1. So we have another sentence. But now we have another existential, and that means that we have to get rid of it. So we check it. We're going to have to write a substitution instance for the places in which y occurs. We can't use A or B, so we have to use a new name. So this basically says that Beth is someone's parent. So let's see, she's the parent of Claire. And this is by the existential in 5. Well, but notice that we have another name, and that means that we have to exploit to instantiate the existential with that same name. So we have, there is a y, P, C, y by the universal in 1. Okay, we have that existential, but we have to get rid of it too. And then we check it, and we have to introduce another name. Let's say D. And that is by the existential in 7. But now we have a D, and we have to use a universal. And well, you know where this is going. We're never going to end. So this tree is never going to end. in any infinite number of steps. So let's think a little bit more about it. We know that this is going to go on forever. The universal requirement of instantiating with all names and the existential requirement that we must introduce new names form an infinite loop. So we end up with a domain with an infinite number of names. We don't really know if we have an infinite number of individuals. There may be only one individual with more than one name, but we have an infinite number of names. Now, we intuit that this argument is invalid, and we can give reasons for it, because, for instance, we can build an analogy with the case of numbers. It is the case that every integer has a successor, but it's not the case that any given number has its own successor. So we know that the argument is invalid. It's just that the counterexample is infinitely large. But there are cases in which things are not that clear. We don't know whether the argument is valid or not. And we don't know at the outset whether the tree is going to be infinitely long or simply finite, but very long. However, what would be desirable is to have a purely mechanical method that can show invalidity in a finite number of steps, without any need for insight or ingenuity. Truth trees are such a method when applied to sentential logic. However, now we're talking about predicate logic, and there is indeed no guarantee that the tree is going to close in a finite number of steps with a definite verdict. Suppose that we are through step 1000 and the tree hasn't closed. Is it because the argument is invalid? Or is it that the argument is invalid and it will close in the next step? If the tree doesn't close then, we face the same situation at every step. We can envision the same situation at step 1,000,000 or at step 1,000,000,000. And this is not an issue with truth trees in particular, but something that is problematic for the very project of designing a purely mechanical decision procedure for invalidity in predicate logic in general. This is a fascinating topic that you'll be able to explore in more advanced courses in logic, but for now, I must say goodbye.